following program on Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations. The following program contains opinions of the participants and does not reflect the views and beliefs of the Derana Media Network. The network believes in a safe space for all ideas to be expressed without any censorship and on its duty to create such a platform for free speech. Viewer discretion is strictly advised.
A very good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Get Real, where we speak to key notable newsmakers here at home and around the world. We try to give you a different perspective into the issues we are discussing on a daily basis, something that is never heard on mainstream media. We're trying to give you a different point. Tonight I want to talk about Sri Lanka's economy, exactly where we are, what we are doing, and the solutions we are applying. Is it beneficial in the long run? Joining me to discuss about that is political economist Devaka Gunawardena. He's standing by in Sacramento, California. I think it's around 12 in the morning right now. Thank you very much, Devaka, for taking the time to speak to us. During the time we are recording it, Devaka has agreed to do this interview from California itself. Good to see you once again, Devaka. Devaka, I want to talk about Sri Lanka's economy right now. The biggest question we have is, last year by this time, Sri Lanka was at a place where we never thought we would recover. But 1 year down the line, if you look at things that is happening today, seems like it's perfectly okay. Is that the case when you're analyzing the economy and trying to figure out what's going on? Or are we being shown something different on the surface, but there's something bigger brewing underneath?
Thank you, Mahieash, for having me on. Absolutely, I think that this is not a crisis that is over. It's continuing to develop. And so the way in which it appears at certain points, it can look like things have sort of stabilized. But the reality is that any kind of massive economic shock, like the one that has occurred to Sri Lanka, is going to reverberate over multiple years. For example, most recently in Greece, there was a euro crisis in 2012, and the Greek economy still hasn't fully recovered, and we're talking about the year 2023. Likewise, the most famous historical example would be the Great Depression of the 1930s. I mean, you had the stock market crash in 1929, but then there was even further depression by 1932, 1933, and even a further recession in 1937. So again, if you're looking at the sort of surface indicators, for example, the appreciation of the rupee, or the stabilization of foreign exchange, it might seem like the worst aspects of the crisis are over. But I think the reality is that for many Sri Lankans, this is unfortunately the darkest period in their history. And I mean, you only have to look at the indicators like child malnutrition, household food insecurity, or the very fact that the poverty rate has, doubled to about 25%, right, in the past year alone. So I don't think that the government has offered any solutions to any of those remaining issues.
Devaka, that's exactly what my conundrum here is. Now, if you look at the indicators, if you look at any press conference, or if you listen to any kind of meeting that is being held by the government, whether the president or the prime minister or anybody comes forward and speaks to the media, they give this impression that the economy is perfectly okay. But when we go into areas away from Colombo and we speak to the people who are trying to, find a daily wage, live in a very, very, very tight situation, especially down south, up north, what they're saying is it's terrible for them. It is, especially the SME sector, people who have been having small shops and all, they can't afford it anymore. And most of them have shut their businesses, and then they are just become, begging seems to be a better option for them. So what are we not seeing? The government is saying everything is hunky-dory, everything is fine, but on the other hand, on the ground level, apparently it's not the case. If you go into a supermarket, prices are really high. If you go into, buy anything, prices are skyrocketing. The common man is not feeling what the government is saying. Why do you think that is?
So I think the government has its own approach, its own strategy. And that is divorced from the reality of people on the ground, as you mentioned, Mahieash. But I think that, the government strategy, honestly, is to ram through as many measures as it can through what has become an illegitimate parliament. So, for example, most recently, they passed the domestic debt restructuring. Now they're talking about labor law reform. Pretty soon it's going to be privatization. And so really this crisis is actually an opportunity for a lot of the changes that they would like to see. But those changes are going to be devastating to the working people. Already, as you've mentioned, the price of kerosene has quadrupled, the price of fuel has tripled, electricity prices have tripled. So, in each case, people have been hit very hard. There's been hardly any relief, right? I mean, in this past year's budget alone, they've only allocated about 0.6% of GDP for social spending, for the social protection.
Welfare.
So again, I think that the government strategy is kind of either to ignore, to sort of present this image that, Sri Lanka is quote unquote back on its feet, but at the same time, they are also trying to suppress that opposition that is emerging in different quarters. And we'll see, where it comes from next, because again, people can only survive so long when their assets are depleted, when their businesses are bankrupt, and there's no real solution that is being offered.
Indeed. Let's talk about what you just mentioned, the domestic debt restructuring effort. Now, it was very interesting for me to read about it when I researched about domestic debt restructuring and countries who've done this and what kind of fate they've met after doing it. One of the articles, the first article that pops up on Google search is an article written by Peter Brewer. Peter Brewer, Devaka, is the chief negotiator of the IMF, who negotiated our $2.9 billion deal with from the IMF side, where he's the one who basically, put all checked all the nooks and crannies and basically came up with that plan and that number. He has written an article in 2021, which he says domestic debt restructuring is completely an operation that you only should do if it is necessary per se. He says that if by any chance, if you get it wrong, the local banks will be affected, the SME sector will take a massive hit, and beyond that, basically it'll come to the point where people will find it very difficult. That would basically bring you back to square one, which where you had to initially restructure your debt. So what he's saying is, if you go down this path, you have to know exactly what you're doing, and if not, it's going to be bad. Now, this is coming from the IMF. The IMF itself says that apparently it's not a good idea. Why do you think the government really pushed for this? Because the opposition is saying that the IMF never wanted it. All the private sector, public sector businesses are saying the IMF never wanted it. And the IMF is saying that, well, we never asked for this. Why do you think the government moved for such a move that is very, very dangerous to Sri Lanka's economy?
So I think the IMF as an institution will sometimes they'll put out contradictory statements. They'll say on the one hand, for example, inequality is a problem, but then the solutions that they design, such as austerity, end up making, for example, inequality worse. So I think there's a contradiction between the IMF's rhetoric and what it actually tries to implement. And so in their report that was released in conjunction with the approval of the loan in March of this year, there is talk in that report about domestic debt restructuring. And really, it's a relatively new recommendation that they're proposing based on the fact that Sri Lanka is supposedly a market access country. But what that means is it's actually a way of sort of imposing austerity in a new form. Because, again, if you look at the government's own, appropriation of this IMF point, they're talking about reducing the gross financing need of the government's debt. So what that means is for the targets that, for example, the IMF has proposed and that the government has seemingly accepted, they want to reduce the gross financing need from about 34% to about 13, 14% in the period over 2027 to 2031. But what this implies is conflating two very different things, which are the foreign debt and the domestic debt. And again, because the IMF is essentially still beholden to the interests of these very powerful creditors and creditor countries, the request has been made to sort of group all this together as, it's an issue of Sri Lanka's debt, rather than say an issue of Sri Lanka's current account deficit or its foreign commercial borrowings. This is really a problem with Sri Lanka's debt. And so what has happened is that that has become an excuse to impose the costs on an entirely different set of people, which are the people who hold the investments in the Employees Provident Fund, for example, or what they call these superannuation funds, meaning retirement funds. And so again, you have the external creditors, big bondholders like BlackRock, for example, that are holding Sri Lanka's sovereign bonds. And then you have, the ordinary working person who needs to survive on their retirement, but they're now being asked to take an interest rate reduction, which, as my colleague Ahilan Kadirgamar and a team of researchers have pointed out, will mean that over a period of about 10 years, by the time that fund is actually cashed out, will have lost about a third of its value. So again, I think this is where...
Let me ask you a question there. Now, the government, when we pose this question to the government, especially the Ministry of Finance or the Central Bank, what they're saying is that apparently we can guarantee that the interest rates is not from funds like the EPF will not be touched and they are not going to get hammered. Devaka, tell me why that is not true, because the logical element of this, something is going to take a hit when you do a domestic debt restructuring effort. We can't just say, everything is perfectly okay and, just believe these people. Sadly, these are the same people who got our economy to this particular point. Now, they're saying, do not worry, EPF is secured. Why are you thinking in a different path there?
So I'm going based on their reports, Mahieash. What they have put out. You have the IMF report from March of 2023 this year, and then you have basically the government accepting these targets. So if they're saying that there's not going to be an interest rate reduction, then that seems to be quite a reversal from what they're putting out in these reports. Because again, if you do the calculations, if you look at it over this period of time, we are talking about a 0.5 percentage point of GDP over 10 years will be taken out of or reduced from these retirement funds that hold the treasury bonds, which have been targeted for this domestic debt restructuring. And remember, even the language that they use is sort of, meant to sort of pass the buck or to hide or obscure what is actually happening. They're calling this domestic debt optimization. Mm-hmm. But again, the same principles apply here. And if these are the targets that they have chosen to accept from the IMF, then they need to be held accountable when they decide that they're planning to go after, the EPF, ETF, and try and call it something else, which it isn't.
Devaka, the words they use, domestic debt optimization. We heard a similar wording prior as well, called soft default. Basically, it's the same thing, but apparently they think that when you come up with different variations of a word, we can fool the people. That's the sad part of it, that apparently they think that utilizing, wordplay would solve the problem. Let's take a short commercial break. I'm in conversation with political economist Devaka Gunawardena, all the way from Sacramento in California. Thank you very much, Devaka, for that. And we will. There's a lot more to discuss about this. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back, everyone, to Get Real. I'm in conversation with political economist Devaka Gunawardena, all the way from Sacramento, California. He joins me via Zoom. Devaka, we've been talking about the debt, DDR, the domestic debt restructuring efforts, and also the IMF pathway that is basically telling us the paradise island is quite close if we follow their, the way forward. What I really want to know is, even though it is not discussed, there is a geopolitical aspect to this entire conversation as well. People are not that much aware of it, but definitely there is the United States interest in Sri Lanka, the geopolitical location, and the hodgepodge of the infighting between China, America, and India, which is basically manifesting itself in Sri Lanka. And those are things that we don't talk much, but definitely we need to. But what I want to ask you first is, where do you think, like with this particular part that the IMF has proposed for Sri Lanka, where do you think they want us to get to? Because what I see with the little knowledge of economics that I have, it is not solving issues of Sri Lanka and making Sri Lanka to stand economically independent. I mean, we are never going to be like Singapore, but what we are going to, what's going to happen is, if we completely follow this path, we're going to be a slave for the Western economies. Basically, we'll be at the behest of organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and all these people. What, in your opinion, in your research, what do you see? Where does IMF wants to take Sri Lanka to?
So, Mahieash, I think, obviously there are many different crises that are happening now around the world. I mean, you had the COVID pandemic, now you have the war in Ukraine. And this is kind of part of what we call global unraveling, meaning the previous hegemon, the US, is being challenged in its authority, but also sort of the not only the backlash to its policies, but also the kinds of effects of its sort of economic direction are now, becoming undone, basically. So, there's a famous author named Giovanni Arrighi, Italian sociologist, and he said that, in the 1970s, you had a major crisis, right, of the gold, the dollar being coupled to the gold standard, and what happened was the dollar was decoupled because of the U.S.'s unsustainable deficits from, the war in Vietnam, all these other crises that were emerging, the OPEC oil shock. And what ended up happening was that actually this unleashed a sort of tsunami of like financialized investment, meaning, all these capital controls, all these sorts of, barriers against financialization were removed. And over time, you had countries that were getting into debt, for example, with these sovereign bonds. And then, the IMF would come in as the lender of last resort, as they put it. But they would impose all these different conditionalities like austerity to say, okay, you need to now balance your budget. But really what it was furthering the interests of these private creditors who, again, they were basically being paid out of the funds of those countries through the restrictions on their budgets and through increased taxes. Now, what's happened in this moment is that it's become unsustainable. I mean, you have over 50 countries now that are in some form of debt distress. And this is after, again, the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And so it's very difficult for the US to reassert leadership over the system. And this becomes what Aregi would call a terminal crisis. Now, what replaces that, I think, is a very open-ended question, but I think we have to keep the question open is, what would be a just arrangement for countries like Sri Lanka that is an alternative to the austerity that is currently being imposed through the IMF?
Indeed. One of the things, like if I understand you correctly, is that the situation is being created because of these geopolitical interests so that they can swoop in at the last moment and basically get what they want, because basically we are in a position where we are unable to get our daily supplies, the essential supplies. So that's exactly what happened last year. That's what we saw after the COVID pandemic. I'm sure all these countries knew that Sri Lanka's economy is not healthy as it should be, and we are going to take a massive hit because tourism and all these areas that we were basically looking in as income earners were drying up. One of the other things, Devaka, I want to understand is, if by any chance, we've seen the IMF putting these conditionalities saying you have to change this, you have to change that, laws needs to be brought in. Now, we recently saw the Central Bank Act, we saw the anti-corruption bill, all these things, even the electricity tariff hike was a request and requirement by the IMF in order for us to get the next tranche. In a situation like that, where would they go next? What would be the next thing that they really want to start meddling with?
So, Mahieash, I think for the first 18 months of this agreement, they're really prioritizing what they call fiscal consolidation, which, again, is another term for austerity. So that means reducing budget expenditures, raising taxes, everything that we've already seen up to this point. But I think that, there is a very clear direction in which they're headed, which is essentially to remake the relations between state and society, the entitlements that ordinary citizens currently enjoy. For example, access to free education, free healthcare. Even, they're proposing these labor law reforms. And, again, like you mentioned earlier, they'll use terms like flexibility, which sound nice, right? But the reality is what it's doing is it's removing these protections that Sri Lanka's working people have won through decades of struggle. For example, you have the termination of the Employee Workmen's Act. And that is something that makes it more difficult to fire an employee. But if in this crisis, people's incomes, real incomes, have practically halved, they're essentially saying, well, we should make it easier to, hire and fire people, right? Because that's what's going to supposedly attract these investors. So I think the logic is, sure, there's always going to be a geopolitical dimension, but I think really this is the logic of capital, which is about dispossession, which is about reducing people to their lowest state, to a state of penury, so that you can extract more value. And again, they can do that through fiscal consolidation, but they can also do it through these quote unquote non-budgetary reforms that end up undermining or even removing protections that people have earned through decades of struggle.
If I may ask, is that with regard to the workplace and the laws regarding labor, Is that what's happening in countries like the United States or in the collective West? Are they basically trying to replicate what's happening there? We should do it because our system basically takes care of the little guy. But their system basically takes care of the 1%, the big guy. So what they're asking us is basically, you forget about the little guy, focus on the big shot, the big guy who's putting the money in.
Absolutely, Mahieash. I think that actually, there is obviously a lot of hypocrisy in the kinds of policies that are applied to countries like Sri Lanka with less leverage, right, in this global system, and the policies that the US can now actually try to experiment with. For example, you're right that historically, the U.S. has undone a lot of its limited welfare protections, right? I mean, you had the New Deal in the 1930s that offered things like Social Security, the right for collective bargaining. And then, in the 1980s, there was this neoliberal counter-revolution led by Ronald Reagan. But now, in fact, the U.S. is realizing, hey, this trajectory doesn't work for us anymore. In addition to whatever, strategic competition with China, we're realizing that a lot of our population, a lot of our people are becoming resentful of the tremendous inequality that has resulted. And so I think the U.S. now enjoys the leverage, the power to be able to say, okay, well, actually, we are going to now engage in some stimulus spending. For example, after the COVID pandemic, every U.S. citizen received about $3,600 if you were below a certain income threshold. Below 150,000, I think, was the income threshold. You received a stimulus payment. And that was a $2 trillion, more than that in these different budget bills. But again, for Sri Lanka, because they say, oh, you don't have the fiscal space, they're, again, imposing this logic of austerity that they are starting to reject themselves. So that is the hypocrisy. But I think the lesson for Sri Lanka is that Sri Lanka, in fact, has been a leader, right? For example, free education, free healthcare. Yes. Sri Lanka was the pride of Asia in terms of its social indicators. So I think that's the legacy we need to return to.
Devaka, one thing now I'm trying to understand, if we take this entire crisis, if we try to understand what really happened, we ran out of dollars in 2022 and we were not able to pay for our essential, basically fuel, medicine, gas, all that was not it was not available because we were not able to pay it. There were no dollars in our coffers. Now, the logical mind dictates that if you do not have dollars, you should go find dollars. So the obvious next question is, how am I to find dollars? Well, the only way you could find dollars, we don't have the power to print them. So then you had to go sell your basically goods and services abroad and get that dollars back into the country. The IMF proposal, I don't know, because whatever that I have read, I still have not got the answer to. But in case you have gone through all these documents and you have read all that, maybe you can tell me something that I do not know. Does the IMF proposal helps us to get to that particular point where we sell more goods and services and it gets our coffers filled with dollars, basically addressing the issue that we were in last year?
So, Mahieash, I think that the IMF, the current government, I mean, they're always fixated on this deus ex machina, this sort of magical theory that if you implement all these changes, the foreign direct investment will just flow in, right? And it has ignored the past roughly now 15 years of post-war experience where the type of investment was speculation, right? It was in real estate, it was in sovereign bonds. So, I think it's always going to be a challenge. And look, let's be realistic. Sri Lanka does not have any easy options. But that being said, there are still ways of getting money. It just requires more effort in redistribution, which is, for example, something they're not talking about. Wealth taxes, or, even other forms of stimulus spending. So again, it goes back to the original point that I always try to hammer home, which is that, you shouldn't conflate two different deficits. One is the current account, like you say, dealing with, imports and exports, for example, and the other is the government's deficit. Now, theoretically, the Sri Lankan government can print rupees, right? It can finance its own deficit. But the question is, what do you invest it in that will help reduce the current account deficit? And this is where we have really tried to stress a stronger argument for self-sufficiency. Food production. Food production is absolutely critical. And, Sri Lanka at one point was relatively self-sufficient in rice, for example, but unfortunately, there are other challenges now because the cost of inputs like fertilizer have gone up. So you need to get creative. You need to think of other ways of increasing yield that might require other types of reforms, like land redistribution, for example. So, again, I think if you're talking about mobilizing the resources within the country, I think there are still alternatives to austerity, such as self-sufficiency. And again, it goes back to, as you mentioned, reducing that current account deficit, bringing Sri Lanka's imports under control, so that then the country also has more leverage.
But the IMF proposal is asking us to basically take that off. You got to, the import restrictions need to be removed, and we must go back into the old way of dealing. But the old way of dealing was the problem. That's why we were in the scenario we were in. So please make some sense into this, because I don't understand what they're saying.
So Mahieash, it's quite simple. If you, in the sense, you're right. The report, of course, is filled with verbiage and technical jargon of these economists. Yeah. But if you look at it, what they're essentially saying is, by 2027, Sri Lanka should be ready to issue sovereign bonds again. Wasn't it the sovereign bonds that got the country into crisis? Absolutely. So what is your plan if it's simply to go back to these foreign commercial borrowings? Again, it's like a snake eating its own tail. They're just asking for more austerity. So yeah, that's pretty much what it is, unfortunately.
Exactly. All right, let's take a short commercial break. I'm in conversation with political economist Dr.Devaka Gunawardena, all the way from Sacramento in California. This is Get Real. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to Get Real. I'm in conversation with Dr.Devaka Gunawardena, all the way from Sacramento, California, in the United States. He is a political economist. Devaka, let's talk about where you are, actually, the United States. Two things are happening. What we are seeing from the news is that the woke culture is eroding into the business aspect of the U.S. The U.S. economy is in dire straits. We are hearing stories of this, that, problems every day. Apparently, their debt to GDP is around 120%, which means basically they are borrowing more than what they can pay. These are things that their politicians are trying to address as well, but they're not getting to any particular position, basically because of the, I think, the woke ideology that is basically ravaging that whole, I think, especially in the areas that you are living in. But what I want to understand is, if their debt to GDP is around 120%, and the IMF is dictating us to bring ours down to, I think, around 90%, and even further down to, I think, around 60%, why the double standards? And shouldn't we do the things the way the United States is doing?
So Mahesh, I would actually disagree about the question of the woke culture, just because I think it's the political dysfunctions of the neoliberal system. Basically, I have a different explanation of sort of why the U.S. is facing the challenges now. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. has gone through several phases of unfinished reform or even revolution. So, for example, in the 1860s, you had the Civil War, and then you had a period called Reconstruction immediately after. And initially, Black people were given the vote in the South, for example, and they were even promised land. And that was destroyed by white supremacist terror, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow, and so on.
Back in the 50s.
Then you had the 1930s. The Great Depression, the New Deal. And again, that was another period of struggle involving unions, involving working people of very diverse backgrounds. And so like that, the US has constantly struggled with these more sort of regressive or reactionary tendencies. The problem is that since the 1980s, really, it has been neoliberalism that has been triumphant. And so we are starting to see signs of pushback. There are strikes now, for example, here and there. But I think, the question of what would be a solution for working people, that remains unanswered in the US, because, even this whole emerging Cold War rhetoric, that the US is engaging in, it's very dangerous, right? Because the reality is there are problems facing countries like Sri Lanka that will not benefit from this type of polarization between global powers. So we really need to prioritize, again, the sorts of issues that were once raised in Sri Lanka as well, like the non-aligned movement, the demands for a new international economic order, all of those progressive demands that were destroyed by the onset of neoliberalism. But in terms of your other point, it's well taken that, yes, absolutely, I think that the US is hypocritical, right, in terms of what it imposes on other countries. But it's a reflection of its own power and what the economists would call original sin for countries like Sri Lanka that are not able to, basically finance their deficit with dollars, right? So if you have a country that is tied into this global economy, and at the center of that economy is this global hegemon, right, that is issuing the dollar, of course, the US can print its own dollars, but a country like Sri Lanka cannot. So that's where we come back to this question or this issue of how do you develop self-sufficiency so that Sri Lanka, again, doesn't have to rely so much on that system where the US can essentially leverage its massive, position and is able to fund its own programs just because it can print its own dollars.
Devaka, let's talk about solutions per se. If by any chance, if you were advising the finance ministry or if you were advising the president, what would you tell them to do different than what they're doing right now? Because what we need to know is, okay, if the IMF approach is wrong, then what's the correct approach? Because people need to be educated of that. Right now, we don't see that conversation coming in. We've been told that we have to be a more export-oriented economy rather than an import-oriented economy in order to basically address the dollar crisis. But then there are a lot of other issues in terms of our economy. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of political interference. We see all that, which is also negative in order for us to grow as the way we want to grow. We don't want to take over the world, but we want to live a very, successful, comfortable life for our people. Everybody wants that. And how do we get to that point? And what would you advise? What would your take be if the solution is not the IMF?
Well, Mahieash, it's a big question, and like I said, I'll just say that again. I think Sri Lanka has a very tough path ahead. But that being said, there are solutions like redistribution, like a wealth tax, for example, that, even when they're proposing, measures such as the domestic debt restructuring, okay, if your goal is to try and cover about 3.3% of the budget, that could be resolved through something like a wealth tax. So we need to think of more redistributive measures. The other thing is that there are also non-budgetary reforms like land redistribution, which again require more innovative thinking about the kind of production that Sri Lanka needs. Now, we've heard this story about exports and, attracting investment for decades now, but it hasn't materialized. So what do you do in a situation where the country is, not only is growth, not really emerging, but in fact, the country is going through its worst depression since the 1930s. Well, you need to get creative, right? You need to think of solutions. So whether it's in terms of food production, in terms of providing credit to cooperatives, whether it's through providing, alternatives like a public distribution system so that people have access to food. These are all measures that in theory, could be proposed. It's just that this current government seems to be stuck on the same IMF agenda, and it does not want to deviate from it.
Devaka, let's talk about another element which is being rarely discussed in this part of the world. It's about these ISBs and more importantly, the people who are holding them, because when we went into this foreign debt restructuring and domestic debt restructuring, we were told that apparently we have to treat both parties equally. So if the if the foreign creditors are taking a haircut or basically losing some of their money, so should the domestic people or the creditors. But the problem in that argument is they're not equal. If you look at the domestic creditor, he does not have the financial strength or the capacity as the people who actually brought the ISBs. The foreign creditors, they are global super giants who basically can take a hit or can take a haircut. If they are asking for 20%, 20% in the foreign creditor market would be nothing for them, but 20% here in Sri Lanka for the local creditor would be really bad, because that would actually cripple their businesses going forward. Now, one of the companies who actually took ISBs is BlackRock. Do you think, and we know by reports that are coming out, BlackRock is basically running, most call it it is the global shadow government. It is trying to influence lots of government, and there have been recordings of former employees of BlackRock saying that they do go and influence and they buy politicians in countries in order to influence their way forward. What exactly have you found out in terms of, BlackRock, Vanguard, and all these kinds of big financial institutions coming into Sri Lanka and buying our own ISBs? What is the benefit for them? Because, Sri Lanka is a developing country, and why do they need to come to a country like Sri Lanka and buy our ISBs? What is the benefit for them?
So, I think, Mahieash, I look at it from an economic perspective. These are opportunities for profit making, right? Investing in a country's sovereign bonds, right? This is speculation. And you could see actually the shift after the 2008 financial crisis. There was a flood of money into these emerging markets, as they called them, like Sri Lanka. And so it's a question of timing in terms of the flows of the money. But when you look at it, the underlying logic, it's both insidious, but it's also incredibly, I think, clear, which is you socialize the costs and you privatize the benefits. And that is really the be-all and end-all of this type of financial speculation. And in fact, it happened even in the US. Wall Street banks were bailed out during the 2008 financial crisis. Not a single banker went to jail, and yet people lost their homes, right? People lost their houses due to the subprime mortgage crisis. So I think, this principle is being applied, unfortunately, on a full scale to an entire country like Sri Lanka. And you're absolutely right that the creditor profiles here are completely different, because there is a big difference between BlackRock and a poor person who has a little bit in their retirement savings, right, and their EPF. And so again, we have to look at the underlying logic, and what it is essentially a form of dispossession. And so again, we need to come up with alternatives, because this is just not sustainable. And we've already talked about these social indicators that are just absolutely devastating.
Thus far, our Hail Mary has been China. Basically, we've been running to China whenever there was a problem, and we've been taking some kind of a handout from them. And it came to a point that it is not sustainable anymore. China has the highest bilateral debt with us. But right now, when you look at how China acted during the Sri Lankan crisis, the crisis of 2022, they were very silent. Why? What exactly is your analysis about China's approach? Is China changing their approach? Because obviously there is a fight between the United States and China, but that is just in the face value. We all know they trade very vigorously with each other. China holds a lot of debt of the United States. Equally, there is back and forth with those two countries. So in a case of if somebody pulls from one end, both will collapse because they're so integrated with each other. So in a situation like that, what do you think? Like we see a lot of silence from China with regard to Sri Lanka's issue right now. Do you see a different element to this, or do you see a different take?
So Mahieash, I think that, there's always a timing, when different creditor countries get involved, whether it's the US, India, China, and they obviously have all of them their own interests. But right now, unfortunately, the global debt crisis really that's affecting countries like Sri Lanka, it's become a bit of a political football, right? I mean, the US, uses this whole quote unquote debt trap claim against China. Yeah. And then China responds. And so like that, they're not actually dealing with the underlying issues, which is we need a new global financial architecture, because really the IMF is failing countries like Sri Lanka. And the IMF, historically, it emerged out of a situation of great devastation, right? World War II, the Bretton Woods institutions were set up, in 1944, right? The design of them and all involving, the famous economists like John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White. So we don't want to reach another point of war, right? Of global precipice in order to deal with the problems facing countries like Sri Lanka. So that really, some people have proposed different alternatives. They said that, maybe through the UN, for example, you can incorporate, a rights perspective into issues such as debt restructuring. Me personally, I think it's going to require a lot of work on the ground. And honestly, it's going to require a lot of opposition on the ground, because Sri Lanka does have the example of for the 1953 Hartal, where people said no. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development came in 1951 with the recommendation to cut the food subsidy, the rice subsidy. In 1953, after the Korean War export boom, rubber prices dropped, and Dudley Senanayake, the UNP government, they tried to implement this recommendation. And what happened? People came out onto the streets and they reversed course. So I think like that, in addition to the multilateral coordination that needs to happen, it will really depend on the struggles on the ground.
There are lots of lessons we can learn from the past, but the sad truth about it is that we are not learning it. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. Very quickly, we are running out of time, Devaka. BRICS nations, is that a solution for Sri Lanka?
So Mahieash, I think, you just mentioned what do we learn from history? And honestly, my own perspective is that, I think there are possibilities, right? I mean, initially there was this creation of the New Development Bank in 2014, but not much really came out of it. Now there's talk of an Asian monetary union. And so I think like that, there will need to continue to be experimentation on a global level. And, who knows, maybe that will also put pressure on the IMF and the possibility of other sorts of lending arrangements that don't require austerity. But as it stands, the BRICS themselves are geopolitically very incoherent, right? I mean, you have Russia, India, China, right? And some of those nations themselves are competitors. So I think, again, the question of what kind of sort of solidaristic initiative that can emerge, it will depend on recovering those examples from the past, like the new international economic order, which our own Gandhi Correa, right, the former Secretary General for United Nations Conference of Trade and Development, he was part of that proposal. So I think we need to revive some of those, and again, think bigger. Absolutely.
That's I mean, when you look at the whole pie, we have lots of options. It's just that not the IMF is the solution kind of scenario. Dr. Devaka Gunawardena, we have to leave it at that. We're running out of time. Thank you very much for taking the time in the wee hours of the night, waking up and speaking to us. I really appreciate it. All the way from Sacramento in California, Dr. Devaka Gunawardena, political economist. Thank you. All right, well, that's all the time we have for you tonight. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll be back again on Sunday with another episode of State of the Nation. See you then. Bye for now.
So sad in the end, oh, in the end, there's a ship that's sailing out in the night. There's a heart that's breaking. I think it's mine. There's a storm a-comin'. You'd better run, boy,